Outside the walls of a 1,000-year-old medieval city, a revolution is in progress.
Today we are really getting integrated, not just into the European Union, but into the whole of the world.
Once dominated by Soviet communism, free markets now rule in the Eastern European nation of Estonia.
I think it makes people much more open than they used to be. They're also much more tolerant for other ways of doing business.
The ideas of one once outrageous yet innovative thinker are now part of the fabric of everyday life here. 8,000 miles away, another such revolution has taken place, resulting in one of the highest standards of living in Latin America. Recovered from a brutal past, the citizens of Chile now enjoy the fruits of capitalism long advocated by a mild-mannered professor from the University of Chicago.
What year are you?
I'll be starting my 5th year.
5th year?
Yeah.
That's too long. 4 years is plenty.
On the eve of receiving what most would consider the greatest honor of his life, he is met with an angry surprise.
You people have such a distorted idea of what went on. Let me tell you some facts.
For most of the 20th century, he was at the center of the epic battles to control the world's economies.
I believe that the major problem which faces this country is how we stop the growth of government. There's one and only one cure, and we all know it. We have to slow down total spending.
Yeah, well, one has to understand that Professor Friedman would blame everything from the First World War to the invasions of Genghis Khan on monetary policy.
I don't agree with him at all.
What Friedman had to offer, as far as Galbraith was concerned, was some of the finest thinking of the 18th century, and it didn't seem terribly relevant to the 20th.
His impact is not only the 20th century, but the 21st century, and I suspect ongoing.
For most of his long life, this controversial and provocative American has championed bold ideas that have by now changed the way much of the world lives. He is Milton Friedman, teacher, scientist, winner of the 1976 Nobel Prize in Economics, and revolutionary intellectual. This is the story of his journey through life and of his struggle to convince the world of the power of his ideas.
Major funding for this program was provided by John Templeton Foundation, Jean I. and Charles H. Bruni Foundation, Chicago Mercantile Exchange, Susquehanna Foundation, Dorothy D. and Joseph A. Mahler Foundation. Additional funding was provided by Barry and Terry Lind, John M. Olin Foundation, William E. Simon Foundation, Gleason Foundation, Robert E. Hannay, Fred M. Young Jr., Randolph Foundation, Bochnowski Family Foundation, the Allison Foundation, Michael Kaiser, Brian D. Singer, America's Home Place, Inc., Chris J. Roofer, Laura and John Fisher.
On a warm San Francisco afternoon, Milton Friedman and his wife Rose are relaxed prior to just one more interview on their remarkable lives together.
On lots of things they thought I was crazy. I once had a graduate student come to see me from Harvard who said he wanted to come and see that crazy man of the West.
Milton and Rose Friedman have been partners for 68 years. As Rose says, 2 partners, 1 career.
Fortunately, I was smart enough to get a degree in the same field that Milton did. Therefore, I could really work with him. And there weren't very many things that he wrote without my sort of saying, it's okay, or giving him whatever suggestions and he was very generous in this respect. Sometimes I helped and sometimes I didn't.
29 years after being honored with the Nobel Prize in Economics, Milton Friedman still attracts the public spotlight. This evening, at a festive ceremony in San Francisco's Ritz-Carlton Hotel, guests gather for presentation of the 2004 Friedman Prize for Advancing Liberty.
somebody with a really big brain, and he's a fighter. And now so much of what he's done is accepted that it's hard to understand how frightening it must have been and how hard he had to fight.
This year's winner of the $500,000 prize is internationally recognized economist and property rights activist Hernando de Soto.
So I'm delighted to be awarded a prize that has Milton's name. I couldn't think of a greater honor.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Milton Friedman.
At 93, Milton Friedman is still a man of ideas. Challenging the status quo has been his life's passion.
History shows that there's a very long lag between changes in the climate of opinion on the one hand and changes in political practice on the other. And the problem that we all have is really to persuade people to practice what they preach. And that's a much more difficult task.
If you're going to try to change things, you have to recognize that it's going to take some effort and that there's going to be some sharp criticism.
Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan has known Milton and Rose Friedman for more than 50 years.
There are very few people over the generations who have ideas that are sufficiently original to materially alter the direction of civilization. Milton is one of those very few people.
There is perhaps no more dramatic evidence of the impact of Milton Friedman's ideas in action than here in the former Soviet Republic of Estonia. Strategically located on the Baltic Sea, Estonia is sandwiched between Russia and Finland. Its capital, Tallinn, surrounds the most well-preserved medieval city in Northern Europe. Dominated by Tsarist Russia and the Soviet Union for nearly 2 centuries, Estonia was an economic backwater. When the Soviet Union dissolved in the early 1990s, Estonia reclaimed its independence. Desperate for a new direction, Estonians elected the youngest prime minister in Europe's history. Mart Laar was 32 years old. Many in his cabinet were in their 20s.
We started from 1992 with inflation 1,000%. We had drop in economy 30%. We had prognosis for unemployment on 35%. We had the shortage of everything. And of course, I didn't know very much about the economy. The only book about the economy what I have read was Milton Friedman, The Freedom of Choice, and that was the only one. So, but there was a lot of good ideas therein, and I introduced a big part of those.
Racing to catch up with the rest of the world, the young Estonians created a low-tax laboratory. The zero corporate tax on profits reinvested in Estonia has made the tiny country a magnet for foreign investment. It is now considered the most competitive of the new European Union members and ranked by the Wall Street Journal as one of the freest economies in the world. One of neighboring Finland's largest electronic companies, Elcoteq, built this manufacturing plant here in Tallinn in 1992. It produces communication equipment. Elcoteq is now Estonia's largest exporter and one of its largest employers. Antti Pipo is the CEO.
Well, it's very simple to say that Estonia, in my mind, is one of the most attractive countries in the European Union.
Among the more innovative aspects of life in Estonia are free internet sites scattered throughout the country. The World Economic Forum reports that per capita, Estonia is more wired than Italy, Belgium, and Spain. And Estonia has adopted one of Milton Friedman's most controversial ideas.
We were the first country introducing really this beautiful idea of the flat rate personal income tax. To be very frank, I didn't know that nobody has done it, but it worked. It worked exactly in the way how it was prognosed by Milton Friedman.
In Estonia today, everyone but the poor pays the same flat tax rate of 24%. No loopholes. 8 other countries in the area, including Russia, are following Estonia's lead. Despite Estonia's obvious prosperity, life is not easy for those who felt cared for under the old Soviet system.
This new situation has been very hard. Of course, it again is not the age what makes the difference. It is the attitude of the people.
Dmitry Galakov has been an engineer at Elkotech for 3 years. He is one of nearly 3,000 employees. Dmitry, his wife Galina, and their daughter Christina are enjoying life in the new Estonia.
A lot of new buildings erecting. New roads are coming. Basically how all the life is changing. It is really interesting to see, actually.
It's more possibilities for our children also.
After generations of domination, Estonia is poised to catch up with the living standards of Western Europe, and they intend to do it in just 1 generation. The free market ideas at work in Estonia were first championed over 200 years ago by a Scottish professor. In his revolutionary book, Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith introduced the free market ideas that would drive the world's economy throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. From his theories came stunning technological innovations and industrial progress. But the horror of the First World War left the world bitter, disillusioned, fearful of free markets, and drawn to the philosophy of government command and control of the economy, a philosophy long advocated by the famous British economist John Maynard Keynes.
There's no danger of a serious rise in the cost of living.
His ideas would dominate economics for the foreseeable future. Keynes said, "The central controls necessary to ensure full employment will, of course, involve a large extension of the traditional functions of government." Even so, in the American Midwest, in a place known for its intense intellectual atmosphere and tolerance of unconventional thinking, others were experimenting with new and different ideas. Here, at the University of Chicago, a derided minority of scholars was forging a link between Adam Smith and what they believed was a new economic science for the 20th century. Among them was Milton Friedman. In time, his name and the Chicago School of Economics would be intertwined. But that would come later. Brooklyn, New York, 1912. Milton Friedman is born to poor immigrant parents. Both had come here from Eastern Europe. Young Milton grows up above their dry goods store in Rahway, New Jersey, while his father also struggles as a jobber in New York, 20 miles away. And for a short time, his mother works in a New York sweatshop.
You're talking about an immigrant household whose emphasis is on how do we make a living. The concept of ideas and of intellectual activity and so on was not a live concept, it just didn't enter in.
At Rahway High School, he is a good student and a voracious reader. At 15, he is preparing to enter his senior year when his father suddenly dies of a heart attack. With the backing of his high school teachers and a scholarship, he goes on to Rutgers College in New Brunswick, New Jersey. To earn money for his education, he and a friend capitalize on the Rutgers tradition that freshmen are required to wear green ties.
We got the green ties from his father and went from door to door in the dormitories selling them. And that gave us the idea that we could do the same thing with books. So the next year, we arranged that spring for Barnes & Noble to come to New Brunswick and offer to buy secondhand books.
Milton and his friend make money, and the students pay less. Early benefits of a free market. 1 year into his studies, America and the world are shaken by the stock market crash of 1929. Black Thursday would evolve into the greatest depression in American history. Millions would lose their jobs, their homes, and their life savings. Half of the nation's banks would fail. By 1932, Milton is 19 years old. He has come to realize that economics is more than a class in college.
It's obvious that it was the state of the world in '32 that led me to go to Chicago. Here was a world in which you had unemployed people and unemployed machines, and obviously a rational situation. It was crazy. Why couldn't you put these people to work to run those machines to produce those clothes that people so desperately needed? So the intellectual interest was in trying to explain that phenomenon.
The economics department at the university is one of the very best in America. The stars are Frank Knight and Jacob Viner. Milton is among a group of brilliant students who have been attracted to this vibrant intellectual atmosphere. Another is Paul Samuelson, a young man who, like Milton, would become a Nobel laureate and one of the most influential economists in America. Throughout their lives, he and Milton would disagree on many things, but remain good friends.
If one can run over, but the other one can't.
Today, Samuelson is retired, but at MIT in Cambridge, he still works with students.
Milton was born smart. It wasn't a question of competitiveness, but just the quickness of his repartee and his IQ, and his fair-mindedness in argument.
I felt almost immediately at home. This seemed like where I was supposed to be. Suddenly in Chicago, in an atmosphere where you've got intense intellectual activity by people who are intellectually sophisticated, who have a much broader background than I did, as a matter of fact, and opened up to a new field. I enter economics. I take Jacob Viner's course, in which he makes me realize for the first time that there is such a thing as a coherent system.
Jacob Viner's class in economics would have a profound personal influence on Milton Friedman. Viner seated his students alphabetically. Next to Milton sat a young woman, also majoring in economics. 6 years later, Rose Director would become his life partner and co-author.
Look, he'd grown up, as I had, in a small town. He wasn't exposed to many of the things that a lot of other kids had been exposed to. And I guess that's one of the things that drew us together. We sort of came from the same background. And therefore, our ideas were pretty much the same. He was more intellectual than I was, but not too much.
Another powerful influence on both Milton and Rose during these years is the professor who would become their close friend. Frank Knight had an unfailing suspicion of government intervention. Milton and Rose would grow to embrace those ideas as their own. But the continuing misery of the Great Depression convinces Americans otherwise.
Herbert Hoover leaves the White House for the last time as president to share the car of America's president-elect in the traditional ride down Pennsylvania Avenue to the steps of the Capitol and inauguration ceremonies. A nation in the depths of economic depression had elected its first Democratic chief executive in 12 years, Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
First of all, let me assert my firm belief
that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
The New Deal was proclaimed a social revolution to lead the nation out of a Great Depression.
The government regulates major industries and creates an array of programs to put people back to work.
Today, depression is a fading memory. Millions of men and women have found employment, and with it, confidence and hope.
By the time Milton completes his studies at Chicago, Roosevelt's New Deal is in full swing. Milton moves to Washington, D.C., and a position with the National Resources Committee. Although he would in time become a tenacious critic, Milton Friedman is, for now, a part of the New Deal.
The Great Works program has removed a vast army from relief roles. It revived lagging industry.
The government market was booming because the government was hiring all sorts of people. And as a result, you had lots of young people, lots of social activities, lots of cocktail parties and stuff like that.
Rose, too, comes to Washington and a New Deal job at the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. In about a year, Milton moves to New York and the National Bureau of Economic Research. The work here will later shape his career and plant the seeds of one of his major contributions to the science of economics. During 1937 and the spring of 1938, while Milton works in New York and Rose in Washington, they keep in touch. After 138 letters, they are married in a traditional ceremony to please Rose's parents. They honeymoon in a little rented cottage on a lake in New England, and quickly learn that married life requires some adjustments. Being economists, they devise a list of numbers for those things they find must be said over and over.
Number 2 was you were right and I was wrong. That's the hardest thing in the world for anybody to say, as we discovered.
There was no electricity. But we had the most wonderful lamps, Aladdin lamps, I think they called them, so that we could work late into the night on writing or reading, and it didn't bother our eyes at all. As a result, we both stayed up very, very late. We slept until noon, and I didn't cook very well, but what I cooked didn't take very long.
She's a wonderful person. She's very warm and thoughtful and very, very much concerned with other people's welfare and not particularly her own.
He is the most tolerant, too much so, that I have ever known. And little of it has rubbed off on me, but not very much.
They didn't know it then, but New England would play a very important role in their future together. In less than a year, the world is once again at war. Milton returns to Washington, to the Treasury Department, where the assignment is to raise money for the war effort. The answer is a withholding tax, the first since the Civil War. Ironically, he will spend the rest of his life fighting to limit taxes and the size of government. On the 7th of May, 1942, Milton testifies before Congress. It is his first such assignment. The subject is the danger of inflation and how to prevent it. He seems to echo the generally accepted big government spending policies of the Englishman John Maynard Keynes.
Received an enormous stimulus.
Everybody sounded Keynesian because everybody was Keynesian more or less to a certain extent at that time.
Gary Becker is a Nobel laureate and professor of economics at the University of Chicago.
Keynes argued that market economies don't have a tendency
left alone to come and get full employment, that unemployment could be a pervasive problem, that therefore one needed a lot of government assistance and investment and the like to bring us up to full employment levels. And that was a dominant paradigm in the study of macroeconomics all over the place.
Keynes' ideas are welcome news to a world fearful of another depression. War rages on in Europe and the Pacific. Milton returns to New York City and Columbia University, where statistical research is part of the war effort. While there, he finishes his PhD. During these years, Milton and Rose begin their family. Daughter Janet is born in 1943. She will grow up to become an attorney.
If my father flies on an airplane with some total stranger, at the end, when he gets off of the airplane, he'll know everything about them. He'll know, who their family is, what their job is, what they like. He's constantly interested in other people.
Son David is born in 1945 and will go on to become a professor of law and economics.
What I liked about it, I think, was that my father really believes in reason. If the child has the right argument and the parent has the wrong argument, then the parent has the same obligation to concede as the child does the other way around. And that was certainly one very important and attractive part of growing up in that family.
I wish that Franklin D. Roosevelt had lived to see this day. General Eisenhower informs me that the forces of Germany have surrendered to the United Nations. The flags of freedom fly all over Europe.
Like most Americans in 1945, the Friedmans are ready for a life after the war. Milton returns to the University of Chicago, where at age 34, he succeeds his mentor, Jacob Viner. For the next 30 years, the University of Chicago will be his spiritual home.
I couldn't bring myself to leave Chicago, not because of its beautiful climate, but because of the quality and the spirit and the attitude in the economics department and indeed in the university at large. It's a place, and a wonderful place, where people are interested in understanding things and in getting at the bottom of things, at the truth, and not primarily in creating a particular record or getting their name in the paper.
Milton and Rose settle into academic life as post-war America becomes the most productive nation in the world.
The government has been aiding in all ways to stimulate the construction of new homes.
In a single decade, the economy triples.
The greatest good. Building material prices are being controlled.
Like the Friedmans, returning servicemen are starting families, buying new homes, and enjoying life.
But demand still far exceeds supply, and will for a long time to come.
Yet elsewhere, the war has left the world in turmoil.
In 1950, men throughout the world learned to look on the brutal face of communism.
Free markets are even less popular than before the war. Socialism and communism now promise government protection from another depression and the unpredictable markets.
It is my duty to place before you certain facts.
Even though British war hero Winston Churchill has been defeated by a socialist candidate, he continues to sound the alarm.
Around them, from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent.
Churchill's words are prophetic. The Soviet Union is actively exporting communism to Eastern Europe. Mao Zedong is leading a communist revolution in China. To noted Austrian economist and eventual Nobel Prize winner Friedrich von Hayek, these are ominous signs. In the spring of 1947, he invites an elite group of economists, political scientists, historians and other intellectuals, including Milton Friedman, to consider the consequences. They call themselves the Mount Pelerin Society for the Swiss town where they held their first meeting.
So far as I personally was concerned, it was a very thrilling meeting. It was the first time I was overseas, the first time I ever met economists, political scientists, and others from other countries around the world. And it was organized because as of that time, the number of people around the world who were firm supporters of liberty, of a classical liberal point of view about human society, were very few and far between, and were beleaguered wherever they were as a small minority.
He came on the scene with what were perceived to be radical ideas in the 1950s and the 1960s, largely because the influence of John Maynard Keynes was about fully pervasive, if I may put it that way.
The Chicago economists were not popular in those days, and Milton Friedman led that group in not being popular. But we felt we had something to say because of what we learned, and it was exhilarating. We were warriors in combat with most of the rest of the profession.
Milton and the others would continue to meet, yet for decades to come, they would be considered a minority. By the 1950s, the Friedman family had been drawn back to the hills of New England, where Milton would further develop some of his most important economic theories. The Dartmouth College Library in nearby Hanover served as Milton's research base. For more than 30 years, New England would be their summer home.
I always used to say, you fly over Maine, New Hampshire, or Vermont, any place you drop a rock is a nice place to spend the summer.
For the first few years, there is the hideaway at Orford, New Hampshire.
It was totally isolated. You got to it on 3 or 4 miles of dirt road. We didn't have a telephone. I think my parents got a telephone when I got my driver's license.